Oh, look at that. Class simulations. So Epic introduced this new chaos class systems in Unreal Engine 5. When I was playing around with this system, I found all the informations, documentations, and tutorials are all scattering around. So I want to put some of the useful information together here and also add my own experience and lessons so that you can actually use this chaos class system in your own projects, and also at the same time to inspire you about how to make it look good and fun. First video, we're gonna talk about the basic setup. We're gonna look at the content example, which is a project provided by Epic itself. We are gonna import some meshes from other 3D softwares, and we are gonna create our first clothing data inside Unreal Engine 5. Quantum example is basically the projects where Epic is making mini demos. I personally find it always helpful to actually see the implementation inside the engines rather than reading the plain text documentation. This time we are searching for the class simulation. Basically inside each demo level, there's gonna be a lot of sections to showcase. If we hit simulations, we can actually see they're being implemented in runtime. So if you're new to the engine and its development process, I highly recommend you to go through this project. If you work a lot with 3D modeling and Unreal Engine, I highly recommend that you use Maya as your default 3D modeling tool, because it seems like Maya works the most compatible with a lot of the features in Unreal Engine. That's 100% my own opinion, but in class simulations, there's one feature of using the collision volume inside each joint to collide with the fabrics. Even with the simplest setup, I couldn't get the models from Blender to work. The models from Maya actually works perfectly. You can see here, this is the model I exported from Blender, and even though there's a huge capsule acting as a collision body, the fabric is not responding to that physics body. But in the Maya setup, all the fabrics are actually wrapped around through that collision capsule. So this is a small showcase of how Maya is a little bit more compatible, and we're gonna talk a lot more about this in the collision sections. We're gonna use Maya as our default 3D software throughout these tutorials. Okay, for our first fabric, we're gonna do a simple setup with just a plane. In the 3D software, we're gonna create the plane, assign materials, rig it, and then skin it, and we export it. Right now, we are actually inside Maya, so in order to create the plane, we go to the poly modeling, and then we hit this icon. We actually get a small, tiny little plane here, and we wanna scale it up. So, channel box. And then we change the scale into 20 on each side. There we get a bigger plane. After that, we want to have more vertices on them. So we go to the inputs, then we click it. So right here, we can see the subdivision width and subdivision height. We push them up into 32. There we have our basic mesh. The next step is to create a material. So we left click on the mesh, right click, assign new material, and then we hit Lambert as our basic materials, and we can see some of the bar pops out, and we go to Lambert 3, rename it into materials underscore plain fabric, and we have our basic material ready. So next step is to rig it. So in order to rig it, we go to the rigging part. We click this icon, meaning the joint, and then we left click on our mesh. So we can see this tiny little sphere popping out, meaning there's a joint there. The position of the joint doesn't matter that much in this part of the tutorial, but still I want to put it at the center. So I would just delete that, hit spacebar, go to the top view, hit at the center, and then hit, and we go back to our normal view. Okay, now we have the basic setup for everything we need ready. So we just need to export it. Go to File, Export All, go into the path that we want. So usually this is the basic setup for the default Unreal project. So we pretty much put all our stuff inside the content folder. For my own habit, I will usually create a folder called geometries to store all the meshes inside. So I would just go inside, name our meshes skeleton mesh plane fabric, and just make sure the file of the type is FBX. You can see it. Where is it? Here. And I believe all the default options are good. So we hit export all, and then we should get our meshes ready to go into Unreal Engine. When we try to import models into Unreal Engine, if we save our models inside the content folder, we will actually see there's going to be a window coming up to ask whether you want to import the latest update. But if we didn't see it, we can just drag it from the folder into the content browser. And just make sure we take the skeleton mesh on. The reason why we import our models into skeleton meshes kind of relates to how cloth is being used in game development. Usually skeleton meshes are those active meshes where we usually apply individual movement into different components of the models to make them move, compared with the static meshes. When the cloth simulation was on, they will actually respond to the movement of the main characters. So actually in the content examples, we can actually see it was trying to present the cloth simulation in one of their characters. When the characters was running around, you can actually see the scarf interacting with the movement. So that's kind of the reason why we import our models as skeleton meshes, even though we don't actually have the character in the model. We only have the fabrics. Now we can see there are 4 assets being generated. Skeleton mesh, skeleton, and physics assets are 3 very important parts. The skeleton asset will show all the skeleton trees, basically all the joints that we had on our meshes. So in the future, when we actually use rig control to move each individual joint, we will go back to the skeleton asset. So the physics asset is in charge of the collision. It will actually create these small collision capsules on each of the joint. And all we need to do right now to create our first closing data is inside the skeleton mesh editor. So we left click on our meshes, right click, create closing data, and make sure we have the right physics assets, and we create. And we actually see there's one new closing data popping up, and we can rename it into plain fabric 001. You notice that we can actually create several closing data from this single meshes. Every time if I create more, they are all gonna show up here. And right now we have our first clothing data created. We haven't applied it yet. So left click on our meshes and then right click, then we apply the clothing data that we just created. And we didn't see anything change because we haven't done anything on our clothing data yet. So in order to change it, we go to here, active cloth pane. When we hit it, we see everything turns into pink. And if I press my left mouse and drag it around, you can actually see I'm painting on this fabric. And if right now I deactivate the cloth pane, you can actually see all this part become acting more like fabrics now. If I go back to the painting mode, you can actually see all those parts acting like clothes are the part where I painted into white. If we slide it down, there's a lot of settings here. So right now it says the paint value is 100%. So when I was pressing my mouse onto the fabrics, I'm actually painting everything into 100s, representing the white part. If I actually change the value into 0, I will actually paint in the black part, just like the shader. So if I deactivate the cloth again, you can actually see, the black part becomes the one that acts not like cloth. The pink area actually represents the default part in mathematical sense, and in my practice, I don't feel like they have any difference from the 0 black part. As you can see, even right now, the paint value is 0, and I'm trying to paint on it. It doesn't make any difference. If I change it into 100 and then paint it to 0, they become black. So that's the basic logic of clothing data painting. So let's create a simple plain fabrics that's floating in the middle of the air. Okay, now we have our first clothing data. Let's put it in the level. So I basically have my empty level open here. There's nothing in it. You can go file, new level, and then choose empty level. Okay, so let's put the fabrics in. Put it into 0, the original point. We can actually see, oh Jesus. Camera is a little bit too fast because we have a tiny little mesh. Let's give it a fog, give some light. Rect. Light. This way. Make sure it's above the origin. Give it like a 10. We see meshes. Oh, the camera is a little bit too slow. Remember to turn on the volumetric fog so we can actually see our light. Okay, a little bit too above. Put it down a bit. We can actually see our meshes. A little bit too small. Let's pump it up. Okay, so we can still see the meshes aren't acting like fabrics because fabric simulation will only be on if we actually run the game or we run the simulation. When I was testing, I would usually just run to simulate the game. Take this option on and then just hit start. We can actually see our fabrics is in the level right now. As you can see, the fabrics doesn't look natural or good. Actually, it looks a little bit more disgusting in the level because we haven't tweaked any of the configurations and parameters yet. In the next video, we're actually going to look at, there's a lot of options to make it look different. We are also going to talk about the masks and also how the material is going to affect the clothing data. So let's tweak some of the configurations to actually make this fabrics looks better. Okay, let's go to environmental settings. We can see all the fabrics are all falling down because it's being affected by the gravity. So actually, let's decrease the gravity to actually make it softer. So right now, it actually feels better. Let's pump up the iteration count and then the subdivision count. Okay, right now it actually looks like a actual fabrics. Also, let's actually give it a wind, which is a global force specifically for the chaos. Let's pump up the strength and we can actually see there's a light blue arrow there representing the direction of the wind. So if we run it right now, the wind is gonna actually blow in the direction of that arrow. And if we select our winds, increase the speed, yeah, you can actually see it was blowing in this way. That's a little bit crazy, but let's bring it back to like a normal value, then change the direction a bit. Okay, that actually feels like a kind of paper, a hard texture floating in the middle of the air. In this technical tips part, I'm gonna talk about some of the common issues that you might encounter and want to debug during this process. The first issue is that when you're trying to import another meshes into the editor, sometimes the skeleton part will be autofilled by some of a skeleton asset that you have imported before. So just make sure this skeleton is actually turned into none. So it will actually create a new asset. And also sometimes you will find that you cannot actually delete the asset that you just imported. The delete doesn't work and then this option is grayed out. It's probably because you are still running the games. So if you stop the simulations, I think you can actually delete those. And the second issue could be when you activate the cloth pane, you don't actually see, the canvas, the painting canvas. That's basically because you haven't selected your clothing data yet. And I think we talked about this before, that you can have several clothing data and also at the same time you can have more masks on each of the clothing data. So every time when you're trying to paint, just make sure you're on the right canvas, you're on the right mask that you want to paint on. The next typical issue would be sometimes when you're in the cloth paint mode, you don't actually see that boundary circle. It's probably because the radius is too big. I think the default radius is set to 128, so you can actually see them in the rim. If you still don't see them, just push them real small, because probably your mesh is too small. So you can paint with a tiny little brush here. Another issue is that if you don't see the class simulation on your meshes, it's probably because you haven't applied the data yet. So if I apply the data, it should be moving, but still it's not moving. This time we can go to characters, clothing. So just make sure you have enabled the class simulation on. If I take that, it should be going. And also from here, you can actually see there's several different options. You can, minimize the gravity and you could push real hard on the gravity. And you can even have a wind going on here. And there's a lot of different options here for debugging. You can actually see the triangles here. Okay, now we've got our first fabric. So in the next lesson, we are gonna look at different configurations and different masks to actually make different kinds of fabrics. I hope you guys are having fun with your first fabrics. If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, definitely remember to check the next video too. So I will see you in the next video.